We live in an age of overstimulation, constant opinions, relentless comparisons, and an almost compulsive need to broadcast every step we take. But there is something radically powerful, even biologically beneficial, about doing the opposite. Focusing on yourself and staying silent isn't just a motivational phrase, it's a neurological tool. When you redirect attention inward toward your habits, your systems, your internal feedback, you begin to rewire your brain's default mode. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and long-term planning, becomes more active when distractions are minimized. Silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's a deliberate space where your nervous system can reset, cortisol drops, heart rate variability improves, your ability to stay present and adaptive increases. Meanwhile, the dopamine system, which drives motivation and reward, gets hijacked by likes, comments, and validation loops when your attention is external. This weakens your ability to pursue goals autonomously. So the rule becomes simple: if it doesn't build you, it drains you. Talking about what you plan to do activates reward circuits prematurely. You get the dopamine hit from sharing instead of from doing. Over time, the brain learns to value sounding productive more than being productive. But when you focus inward and act in silence, neuroplasticity does its job. The brain adapts, reset, cortisol drops, heart rate variability improves, your ability to stay present and adaptive increases. Meanwhile, the dopamine system, which drives motivation and reward, gets hijacked by likes, comments, and validation loops when your attention is external. This weakens your ability to pursue goals autonomously. So the rule becomes simple: if it doesn't build you, it drains you. Talking about what you plan to do activates reward circuits prematurely. You get the dopamine hit from sharing instead of from doing. Over time, the brain learns to value sounding productive more than being productive. But when you focus inward and act in silence, neuroplasticity does its job. The brain adapts to your consistent inputs. You begin to develop deeper grooves of discipline, resilience, and identity. This doesn't mean you isolate yourself. It means you prioritize your internal world over external noise. You listen more, you judge less, you operate on data, not drama. And that silence, it becomes your edge, because while others speak, explain, justify, you're moving quietly, consistently, effectively. Eventually, results speak louder than words ever could. Closing, steady, grounded delivery. So focus on yourself. Stay silent. Let your nervous system align with your goals. Let your habits shape your identity. And let your actions do the talking. The brain is an energy-intensive organ. Despite accounting for only about 2% of total body weight, it consumes nearly 20% of the body's energy at rest. That energy isn't distributed randomly. Neural efficiency, the ability to process information accurately with minimal energy waste, is largely determined by where and how you direct your attention. When attention is scattered across multiple stimuli, tasks, or mental loops, neural resources are depleted quickly. The brain's prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for executive function, decision-making, and goal planning, becomes overwhelmed by competing signals. This results in mental fatigue, impulsivity, and reduced task performance. But when attention is directed, focused intentionally on a singular task, goal, or internal process, neural circuits begin to specialize. They become more streamlined and more effective at processing relevant data while filtering out noise. This process is grounded in the principle of neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself in response to repeated patterns of behavior and attention. When you consistently attend to one goal or domain, the associated neural pathways become more efficient. Synaptic pruning occurs, unused connections are eliminated, and heavily used ones are strengthened. The brain begins to reallocate energy, reinforcing circuits that align with what you focus on and diminishing those that don't serve your purpose. At the microscopic level, attention drives changes in the way neurons fire and communicate. Focused attention recruits activity from specialized networks such as the dorsal attention network, which orients your brain toward goal-relevant stimuli. These networks interact dynamically with the default mode network, which governs internal dialogue, mind wandering, and self-referential thoughts. When attention is directed externally with intent, the default mode network is suppressed and mental energy is diverted toward more action-oriented systems. The result is heightened task precision, improved memory encoding, and greater emotional regulation. Scientific studies using fMRI and EEG show that individuals who regularly engage in deep focused work or mindfulness practices exhibit enhanced prefrontal cortex function. Their brains show reduced activity in areas associated with distraction and increased activation in regions tied to cognitive control. Over time, this reconfiguration results in improved cognitive stamina and faster information processing. In simple terms, the brain gets better at using less to do more. Distraction, on the other hand, is a hidden tax on neural efficiency. Every time you switch tasks or split your focus checking a phone notification, skimming through social media, or toggling between tabs, your brain has to reorient itself. This process, known as attention residue, leaves fragments of the previous task in working memory, decreasing accuracy and processing speed on the next one. The more often this occurs, the more diffuse and disorganized your cognitive output becomes. Directed attention eliminates this tax by minimizing task switching and allowing for uninterrupted cognitive engagement. From a physiological standpoint, focused attention also influences neurochemical activity. When you immerse yourself in a single task, levels of neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine rise in the brain. These chemicals are associated with alertness, motivation, and reward prediction. Sustained levels of these neuromodulators improve signal-to-noise ratio in the brain, which means relevant stimuli are enhanced while irrelevant ones are suppressed. This biochemical tuning creates a neural environment optimized for flow states and high-performance learning. In environments where information is constant and stimulation is endless, the ability to direct and sustain attention becomes a competitive advantage, not just in terms of productivity or performance, but in cognitive health, emotional regulation, and identity formation. You become neurologically more of what you repeatedly focus on. This isn't philosophy, it's the biology of attention. The circuits that fire together wire together, and those that get reinforced become more dominant over time. Focus doesn't just change what you think, it changes how your brain works, down to the level of neurons and synapses. Silence plays a far more significant role in regulating the nervous system than most people realize. While it might be tempting to think of silence as simply the absence of sound or conversation, it is, in fact, a powerful environmental and physiological condition that directly affects brain function, emotional regulation, and physical health. From a neuroscience perspective, silence allows the nervous system to shift from a reactive, high-stress mode to a state of restoration and balance. At the core of this regulatory process is the autonomic nervous system, which consists of two main branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic system is associated with the fight or flight response. It mobilizes the body in response to perceived threats by increasing heart rate, releasing stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, and heightening alertness. This system is crucial for survival in moments of danger or high demand. However, when chronically activated by noise, constant engagement, or overstimulation, it leads to fatigue, burnout, and long-term health problems. Silence provides an essential counterbalance. It engages the parasympathetic nervous system, also known as the rest and digest system. This branch is responsible for calming the body down after stress. In silence, the body naturally reduces its production of stress hormones, lowers heart rate and blood pressure, and promotes digestive and immune function. The vagus nerve, a key player in parasympathetic activation, becomes more active during quiet states, leading to an increased sense of relaxation and emotional regulation. Scientific research supports this. For example, a study conducted in 2006 by Duke University researchers found that 2 minutes of silence can be more relaxing than listening to relaxing music. Participants exposed to silence showed decreased blood pressure and improved blood circulation. This is because silence does not require the brain to process external auditory information, which reduces cortical activity and gives the nervous system space to downregulate. Silence also affects the brain structurally and functionally. When the environment is quiet, the brain is better able to engage in internal processes such as introspection, memory consolidation, and self-awareness. The default mode network, DEM, a network of interacting brain regions that is active when the mind is at rest and not focused on the outside world, becomes dominant during periods of silence. The DEM supports functions like autobiographical memory, future planning, and emotional processing. In silence, the DEM is more active and can operate without interference from task-related stimuli. The hippocampus, a region of the brain involved in memory and emotional regulation, also benefits from silence. In animal studies, it has been shown that silence can stimulate the growth of new neurons in the hippocampus. This process, known as neurogenesis, is closely linked to improved learning, emotional balance, and cognitive flexibility. In humans, while direct measurement is more complex, related studies suggest that quiet environments enhance the brain's ability to store and retrieve memories and process emotional experiences more effectively. Moreover, silence reduces sensory overload. In modern environments filled with alerts, messages, conversations, traffic, and background noise, the sensory system is constantly processing information. This continuous input keeps the nervous system in a heightened state of vigilance, even if the stimuli are not consciously perceived as threatening. Chronic exposure to low-level noise has been associated with elevated levels of cortisol and disrupted sleep patterns. Silence removes this barrage of input, giving the sensory and nervous systems a chance to reset. The psychological effects of silence are also closely tied to its physiological benefits. When external distractions are removed, individuals often become more attuned to their internal states. This can lead to a deeper understanding of emotions, greater insight into behaviors, and the capacity to notice and modify thought patterns. From a regulatory standpoint, this internal awareness, also referred to as interoception, enhances self-regulation. People become better at recognizing stress signals early and taking steps to manage them before they escalate. Breathing patterns also change in silence. With the absence of stimulation, breathing naturally slows and deepens. This shift in respiration further engages the parasympathetic system. Diaphragmatic or belly breathing becomes more prominent, which has been shown to reduce anxiety, lower heart rate, and enhance focus. This physiological loop, silence promoting deep breathing, which then reinforces nervous system calm, illustrates how tightly interconnected environmental cues and internal states are. From a neurochemical perspective, silence allows for recalibration. Dopamine levels stabilize, serotonin activity becomes more balanced, and the brain is able to return to a state of homeostasis. This is particularly important in a world where constant engagement, digital or social, can skew neurotransmitter levels toward patterns associated with addiction, compulsivity, or chronic stress. Even short periods of intentional silence throughout the day can have cumulative effects. Just a few minutes of quiet between meetings, before sleep, or during a morning routine can signal to the brain and body that it's safe to relax. These micro moments compound over time, teaching the nervous system that it doesn't always need to be on high alert. Dopamine is a key neuromodulator in the brain, heavily involved in motivation, reward, goal-directed behavior, and learning. It plays a crucial role in how we pursue goals and how we perceive the value of those goals. However, its system is not immune to manipulation, and in the modern world, one of the most pervasive and often overlooked sources of dopamine interference is the pursuit of social validation. Social validation, like shares, praise, recognition, can hijack the brain's natural reward circuitry and gradually shift motivation from intrinsic to extrinsic sources. The dopamine system functions through a series of neural pathways, most notably the mesolimbic pathway, which connects the ventral tegmental area, vita, to the nucleus accumbens. This system gets activated when we anticipate or receive a reward. The more novel or unexpected the reward, the greater the dopamine release. In ancestral environments, this system evolved to motivate survival-enhancing behaviors, finding food, bonding with others, acquiring skills. In modern environments, however, the same circuits can be triggered artificially by digital and social feedback mechanisms. Social media platforms, for example, are intentionally engineered to exploit the dopamine system. Each notification, like, or comment becomes a small, unpredictable reward. This unpredictability is key. Just like in slot machines, the variable reward schedule, where you don't know when or how the reward is coming, is the most effective at keeping the dopamine system engaged. The result is a loop where the brain begins to crave more of the stimulus that produces this unpredictable hit of reward, regardless of whether it aligns with long-term goals or values. As individuals begin to derive primarily from external feedback, a shift occurs in the motivational structure of the brain. Activities that were once pursued for their intrinsic value, learning, creating, problem-solving, can begin to lose their appeal unless they are accompanied by some form of external validation. The brain starts associating effort not with progress or mastery, but with recognition and applause. This shifts behavior from being process-oriented to performance-oriented. In other words, the focus moves from doing the work to being seen doing the work. This externalization of reward creates a mismatch between the brain's expectation of fulfillment and the actual experience. Dopamine is involved in anticipation more than in the reward itself. Once a reward is received, especially if it becomes frequent or predictable, the dopamine response diminishes. This is known as reward adaptation or hedonic adaptation. What was once exciting becomes baseline. The brain then seeks bigger or more frequent sources of stimulation to achieve the same neurochemical payoff. In the context of social validation, this can lead to compulsive posting, excessive self-monitoring, or even performing life choices based on what will generate approval rather than what is aligned with personal values or growth. This hijacking has implications beyond just behavior. It alters how the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for planning, self-regulation, and future-oriented thinking, interacts with the reward system. Normally, the prefrontal cortex helps evaluate the long-term consequences of actions and suppresses impulsive behavior when necessary. However, when dopamine is consistently triggered by immediate external sources, it can begin to override the prefrontal cortex's ability to maintain long-term focus. This results in reduced patience, diminished attention span, and increased difficulty delaying gratification, all of which are crucial for achieving meaningful goals. Furthermore, when dopamine is tied closely to social validation, individuals can become neurologically dependent on others' opinions for their sense of progress or worth. This not only increases vulnerability to anxiety and depression, but also fragments identity. The self becomes tethered to feedback loops outside of conscious control. Over time, this creates a chronic, low-grade stress state in the brain. The uncertainty of social feedback, how a post will be received, whether recognition will come, keeps the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, in a heightened state of vigilance. Cortisol levels rise in response, leading to sleep disturbances, irritability, and diminished cognitive flexibility. The pursuit of social validation also changes the way the brain encodes memories and experiences. Events that are documented and shared publicly often feel more significant than those that are not. The dopamine system strengthens memory traces associated with reward, so the events that receive the most validation become disproportionately important in one's mental narrative. This alters perception of reality and can lead to an overemphasis on image management, sometimes at the expense of genuine experience. Even in face-to-face environments, the need for validation can override authentic communication. Rather than speaking to convey thoughts or emotions honestly, individuals may begin speaking in ways that maximize approval or minimize disapproval. This behavioral adaptation may not always be conscious, but its roots are in the neurochemical reward system, specifically in the way dopamine has been conditioned to fire in response to others' reactions rather than personal insight or truth. When left unchecked, this process can result in a subtle but powerful dependency, a brain that no longer knows how to reward itself without applause. Mental energy is a finite biological resource governed by both neural architecture and metabolic constraints. Just like physical stamina, it can be depleted, redirected, or conserved based on how it is used throughout the day. Many people assume that mental exhaustion is purely emotional or psychological, but neuroscience reveals that the brain's ability to sustain focused decision-making, emotional regulation, and creativity depends on limited biochemical and electrical resources. When mental energy runs low, cognitive performance declines, impulse control weakens, and decision fatigue sets in. The brain operates on glucose and oxygen to fuel neuronal activity. Although it weighs only about 2% of the body's total mass, it consumes roughly 20% of the body's resting metabolic energy. This high demand makes the brain extremely sensitive to inefficiencies. Tasks that require intense concentration, complex reasoning, or emotional restraint demand more resources from the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for executive functions like planning, prioritization, and goal tracking. This part of the brain doesn't operate in an unlimited capacity. Every decision, every act of self-control, every shift of attention draws from a finite pool of cognitive resources. This is why the concept of decision fatigue is not simply a motivational idea, it's grounded in observable neurobiology. Studies have shown that after prolonged periods of decision-making or self-regulation, the prefrontal cortex begins to show reduced activity. This leads to more impulsive behaviors, poor choices, and a reliance on habits or default behaviors. The quality of decisions deteriorates not because of a lack of willpower in the abstract sense, but because the underlying neural systems are literally running out of fuel and functional capacity. This is also why even small, seemingly insignificant choices throughout the day can cumulatively drain your mental energy. Another layer to this depletion is attention. Attention is an energy-expensive process, especially when it involves shifting from one task to another. Each time attention is refocused, such as switching from deep work to checking notifications or bouncing between multiple tasks, the brain incurs what's known as a switching cost. This cost is not just a delay in resuming the original task, it also involves a loss of momentum and a reallocation of cognitive resources. The brain must activate a new set of neural circuits while downregulating others. These rapid transitions burn more glucose, increase mental fatigue, and reduce overall efficiency. Over time, chronic task switching fragments attention and leads to shallow thinking as the brain becomes trained to operate in a reactive rather than deliberate mode. The emotional load carried throughout the day also drains mental energy. The brain does not compartmentalize cognitive and emotional tasks as distinctly as one might think. Emotional processing, especially when it involves unresolved stress, social tension, or internal conflict, pulls heavily from the same prefrontal networks used for logic and decision-making. This means that even if you are not actively engaging in complex tasks, carrying emotional residue or anticipatory stress can silently deplete your mental energy reserves. The limbic system, particularly the amygdala, becomes more reactive under stress, which in turn demands more regulation from the prefrontal cortex, again drawing from the same limited pool of energy. Even environmental factors play a role. Overexposure to noise, clutter, or chaotic environments forces the brain to exert more effort filtering out irrelevant stimuli. This sensory filtering is largely unconscious, but it has a real cognitive cost. Similarly, engaging in conversations, especially those that are emotionally charged or involve high levels of social monitoring, requires significant mental effort. The need to regulate tone, track multiple social cues, and manage one's own internal reactions places a substantial load on working memory and attentional control systems. Sleep, or lack thereof, also directly affects the availability of mental energy. During deep sleep stages, the brain performs maintenance tasks such as clearing metabolic waste, consolidating memory, and resetting neurochemical balances. Inadequate or fragmented sleep disrupts these processes, leading to impaired glucose metabolism in the prefrontal cortex and diminished dopamine receptor sensitivity. The result is a brain that starts the day already compromised in terms of clarity, resilience, and focus. Even routines and habits influence how mental energy is conserved or spent. Habits, by their nature, are energy-saving mechanisms. When behaviors are automated through repetition, they move from the prefrontal cortex to deeper brain structures like the basal ganglia. This shift reduces cognitive load, freeing up energy for other tasks. Conversely, constantly reinventing routines, second-guessing every action, or living in a state of perpetual novelty burns through more energy as the brain must repeatedly solve problems from scratch. Thus, the structure of daily life, whether it supports efficiency or introduces friction, becomes a major factor in how mental energy is allocated and preserved. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. This capacity allows the brain to adapt to new experiences, learn new information, and recover from injury. While it is often romanticized as a limitless tool for transformation, neuroplasticity is not indiscriminate. It does not respond equally to all types of stimuli. Instead, it is shaped by consistency, frequency, and relevance. Among these, repetition plays the most powerful role. Repeated patterns, whether cognitive, emotional, or behavioral, are more likely to induce long-term changes in brain circuitry than sporadic, noisy inputs. In fact, one of the brain's primary mechanisms for encoding change is the reinforcement of signal over noise. At the synaptic level, repetition strengthens communication between neurons. When two neurons are activated simultaneously and repeatedly, the connection between them becomes more efficient. This phenomenon, described by the principal cells that fire together, wire together, is a cornerstone of Hebbian theory in neuroscience. Over time, repeated activation leads to structural changes. Dendrites grow, synaptic receptors increase in density, and myelination improves signal transmission speed. These changes don't happen after a single exposure or even occasional practice. They occur after sustained repetition, which the brain interprets as evidence of relevance or necessity. Noise, on the other hand, refers to randomness, inconsistency, and lack of meaningful pattern. From a neurobiological perspective, noisy input fails to produce strong or lasting synaptic changes. Random stimuli may trigger transient neural activity, but without repetition, the brain doesn't prioritize it for consolidation. The reason is energy efficiency. The brain is metabolically expensive to run, and it must allocate its resources to stimuli that are likely to matter in the future. Repetition signals reliability, noise signals irrelevance. As a result, the brain discards noise and reinforces what appears frequently and predictably. In learning environments, this distinction becomes especially clear. When new skills or concepts are introduced, the initial neural encoding is fragile. Without consistent rehearsal, the synaptic connections formed during that first exposure begin to degrade. But when the information or behavior is repeated, spaced appropriately over time, those circuits are stabilized through long-term potentiation. This is why mastery of any domain, language, music, mathematics, movement depends on structured, focused repetition. Sporadic engagement, no matter how intense, does not yield the same structural transformation. Repetition also enables the brain to filter complexity and extract patterns. For example, when learning a new motor skill, the brain doesn't just memorize the exact muscle movements, it develops a generalizable model of the action. With each repetition, errors are detected and corrected, and the neural map becomes more precise. This process is facilitated by the cerebellum and motor cortex, which adapt based on feedback. In contrast, exposure to constantly changing inputs without reinforcement results in superficial encoding. The brain cannot extract meaningful patterns from chaos, so the learning remains shallow and easily lost. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and long-term planning, also benefits from repetition. Repeated engagement in goal-directed thought strengthens the brain's capacity for focus, impulse control, and decision-making. Meditation, for example, alters the structure of the prefrontal cortex and default mode network through repeated mental redirection. It is not the act of sitting in silence once or twice that drives change, but the repeated act of bringing attention back again and again. Neuroplasticity rewards that consistency by reinforcing the associated neural pathways and reducing the brain's susceptibility to distraction. In contrast, environments filled with novelty and unpredictability, constant notifications, shifting goals, and fragmented attention trigger a state of continuous orientation toward external stimuli. While novelty can initially spike dopamine and increase short-term engagement, it does not necessarily lead to durable learning. The neural pathways activated by noise fade quickly because they are not reinforced. In fact, overexposure to noisy environments can impair the brain's ability to engage in deeper, slower modes of cognition. The rapid switching required to navigate these environments keeps the brain in a reactive state, dominated by the salience network rather than the focused engagement of the central executive network. Habit formation is another domain where repetition demonstrates its superiority over noise. Habits are the result of repeated behaviors encoded in the basal ganglia, a brain region involved in automating routine actions. Once a behavior becomes habitual, it requires significantly less cognitive effort to perform. This frees up mental resources for more complex tasks. However, for this automation to occur, the behavior must be repeated in a consistent context. Random or inconsistent attempts to initiate a habit provide insufficient data for the brain to recognize a reliable pattern. Noise, in this case, becomes a signal that the behavior is not worth encoding. Emotional patterns also follow this principle. The brain does not just encode actions and thoughts, it encodes emotional responses. If a certain type of reaction, anger, fear, calm is repeated in response to similar stimuli, the associated neural circuits become more easily activated. Over time, these responses become default settings, influencing perception and behavior automatically. Changing these emotional patterns requires repeated practice of alternative responses, often through deliberate interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy. A single insight or epiphany may offer temporary clarity, but without repetition, the emotional circuitry remains unchanged. Ultimately, the brain is a system designed for efficiency. It encodes what is repeated and discards what is inconsistent. This principle underlies how we learn, adapt, and even form identity. The most lasting changes, whether in skill, thought, behavior, or emotion, are not the result of scattered bursts of inspiration, but the slow and deliberate accumulation of repeated effort over time. Silence is often misunderstood as mere absence of noise, absence of speech, absence of interaction. But from a psychological and neurological perspective, silence is an active and potent force. It is a container, a stabilizer, and a catalyst. In the context of human behavior and mental performance, silence plays a powerful role in building psychological momentum, a state in which motivation, clarity, and action align to propel a person forward with increasing effectiveness. This momentum is not born from external stimulation or rapid activity, but from internal alignment, something silence makes possible. Psychological momentum is a phenomenon observed in peak performers across disciplines. It's the feeling of being in flow, where each action builds on the last, effort feels fluid, and distractions seem to fall away. Neuroscientifically, momentum arises when the brain's cognitive and emotional systems synchronize, allowing for increased focus, motivation, and confidence. Silence is not just compatible with this process, it often initiates it. In silence, the brain is given the space it needs to consolidate thoughts, refine direction, and prepare for sustained effort. One of the first things silence does is reduce cognitive interference. In a world saturated with auditory input and social interaction, the mind is frequently forced to divide attention between multiple sources. Each distraction, no matter how minor, creates cognitive load, microscopic drains on mental resources that add up throughout the day. In silence, those inputs fade. The prefrontal cortex, which governs working memory, decision-making, and goal tracking, experiences a reduction in competing demands. This allows for greater mental clarity, the cornerstone of psychological momentum. Silence also creates a unique condition for metacognition, the ability to think about one's own thinking. In silence, the mind is not occupied with response or reaction. It begins to observe its own processes. Patterns emerge, intentions are reevaluated, priorities reassert themselves. Removed, the person is left with a choice to act or to avoid. Each time action is chosen in the face of internal resistance, self-trust is strengthened. That trust compounds, forming the backbone of psychological momentum. Even in goal pursuit, silence serves a functional role. When one completes a task and immediately plunges into the next, the psychological system may register productivity, but not progress. Silence between efforts allows for the mental integration of accomplishments, reinforcing a sense of progress. This perceived progress is a powerful motivator. The brain releases dopamine not just in response to rewards, but in response to perceived progress toward a meaningful goal. Silent reflection enhances that perception, making the next action more appealing and more likely to succeed. This self-awareness is critical for momentum because it gives the individual a clear internal map where they are, what they value, and what they are trying to achieve. From this map, a sense of direction strengthens, and when direction is clear, motivation intensifies. People are far more likely to take action and maintain it when they know why they are acting. Another way silence supports momentum is by reducing emotional volatility. Constant engagement with external stimuli, especially social feedback, digital noise, and environmental stressors, keeps the nervous system in a heightened state of alertness. This alertness may offer short bursts of energy, but it comes at the cost of sustainability. Psychological momentum is not about intensity in the moment, it's about consistency over time. Silence engages the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms the body and stabilizes mood. This emotional regulation creates the conditions for sustained effort rather than the stop-start cycles of reactive behavior. The role of silence and momentum is also physiological. During silent states, especially those of intentional solitude or reflection, the brain's default mode network, DIM, becomes active. This network is responsible for internal narrative construction, future simulation, and autobiographical reflection. While the DIM is often associated with daydreaming or introspection, it plays a critical role in long-term planning and motivation. When given time to operate without interruption, it helps consolidate goals into meaningful personal narratives. The brain begins to link future outcomes to present behavior, reinforcing the internal drive to stay consistent with one's goals. That linkage between the present and the future is a fundamental component of momentum. Silence also nurtures discipline. In stillness, urges and impulses become more visible. The mind starts to recognize the difference between distractions and priorities. Without constant noise to hide behind, the individual is faced with their own resistance, procrastination, self-doubt, avoidance. This confrontation is not always comfortable, but it is clarifying. Once the noise is in a performance context, silence allows for recalibration. Athletes, artists, thinkers all benefit from moments of disengagement from stimulation. In silence, sensory systems reset, emotional patterns stabilize, and strategic clarity reemerges. This resets the baseline from which action is taken. Each time this baseline is reestablished, it becomes easier to return to the task with full attention and renewed commitment. Over time, this practice of using silence to return to center strengthens both focus and confidence. Ultimately, silence is not passive. It is an active cognitive environment that allows the brain and mind to align. It makes space for thought to become coherent, for emotion to stabilize, and for intention to solidify. When these elements converge, psychological momentum is no longer a fleeting state. It becomes a durable internal engine for growth and sustained performance. The human brain is inherently plastic, constantly reshaping itself based on what it repeatedly attends to. Focus is not a neutral activity, it is directive. It instructs the brain on what to wire, what to prioritize, and ultimately what to become. Over time, what an individual pays attention to intentionally or passively forms the architecture of the self. This means that focus is not just a tool for productivity or success, it is a mechanism of identity construction. Where focus goes, energy flows, and what repeatedly receives that energy becomes a defining part of how a person perceives themselves and interacts with the world. At the neurological level, sustained attention drives structural changes in the brain. Neural circuits that are repeatedly activated become more efficient and dominant through a process called long-term potentiation. This principle underlies learning and habit formation, but its effects extend deeper. When focus is repeatedly directed at specific thoughts, behaviors, or emotional states, those patterns become more deeply embedded and more readily accessible. The more the brain is trained to think in a certain way, the easier it becomes to access that way of thinking. And the more likely it is to be perceived as intrinsic rather than constructed. In other words, the brain begins to mistake repeated thought for self-definition. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for goal setting, decision-making, and attention control, is central to this process. It works with the limbic system to evaluate which stimuli are relevant or meaningful, and then filters the environment accordingly. As attention becomes repeatedly focused on certain goals, fears, ambitions, or narratives, the brain reshapes itself to accommodate those mental habits. Someone who continually focuses on problems and threats begins to experience the world through the lens of anxiety. Someone who habitually focuses on discipline and effort starts to identify with resilience. The mental lens eventually becomes the self-concept. This phenomenon is reinforced by the brain's predictive nature. The brain does not passively register reality, it constantly anticipates what will happen based on past patterns of attention and behavior. If a person's focus is consistently on scarcity, the brain begins to expect scarcity, look for it, and interpret ambiguous data through that filter. This leads to a feedback loop where the brain's expectations shape perception, and perception reinforces identity. Over time, the individual is no longer choosing to focus on a certain reality, it becomes the default filter through which all information is processed. Focus also dictates behavioral identity. The repetition of focused action creates neural shortcuts that reduce the cognitive load required to perform those actions. These shortcuts become habits, and habits are often mistaken for personality. A person who consistently focuses on physical training begins to move, plan, and even rest in ways that reflect a trained mind. They begin to identify as an athlete not just because they perform athletic activities, but because their attention has restructured their values, routines, and self-image to match that domain. Similarly, a person who focuses intensely on intellectual exploration eventually sees themselves as a thinker or creator, even if they did not start with that identity. The emotional implications of this are profound. Focus determines not just external results, but internal narrative. The stories people tell themselves about who they are often constructed from the emotional residue of what they focus on most. Focus on failure fosters a sense of inadequacy. Focus on growth creates a sense of agency. These emotional patterns, once established, become central to identity formation. They affect confidence, motivation, and resilience by shaping how the individual explains events to themselves, whether they interpret challenges as evidence of worthlessness or opportunities for learning. Attention also serves as a selective filter for memory. The brain is constantly taking in more information than it can consciously process. What gets encoded into long-term memory is not a neutral sampling of experiences, but rather what has been marked by attention and emotional salience. If a person consistently focuses on painful or humiliating experiences, those become disproportionately influential in shaping self-concept. Conversely, deliberate focus on constructive experiences reinforces a more adaptive and empowered narrative. Over time, memory becomes a curated archive of what one has paid attention to, and that archive becomes the foundation upon which identity is constructed. In modern environments, attention is under constant assault. The shift from internally directed focus to externally manipulated attention through social media, advertising, or digital noise outsources the construction of identity to algorithms and feedback loops. This weakens the individual's agency over their own narrative. When attention is fractured, identity becomes fragmented. When focus is reactive, identity is unstable. Only through intentional focus, deliberate, repeated, and aligned with deeply held values, can a coherent and resilient